On a winter morning in Gilded Age, New York, a modest young governess climbs the steps of a silent Fifth Avenue mansion. Inside, 3 wild, grieving children have chased away every nanny, and a widowed railroad tycoon has locked his heart behind duty, guilt, and cold perfection. When Lucinda Hartwell crosses that threshold, she doesn't just enter a house. She walks into a storm of secrets, whispered scandals, and a choice that will test her courage, protect her reputation, or fight for a forbidden love. Tell me, from where in the world are you listening? And what do you love most about historical romances? New York City, winter of 1883. The gaslight flickered low in the morning fog, casting golden halos along the snow-laced avenues of Fifth Avenue. Carriages whispered past frozen hedges and iron gates, wheels creaking against the silence of wealth. It was into this hushed world that Lucinda Hartwell stepped, her boots damp with slush and her carpet bag gripped tightly in her gloved hand. The Ashford mansion loomed ahead like a cathedral of stone and sorrow. 4 stories of carved granite, shuttered windows, and immaculate dormers crowned by a faint wisp of chimney smoke. Not a sound stirred from within. The columns that framed the front entrance seemed more sentries than decoration, cold and unwelcoming. Lucinda paused at the base of the steps, drawing a breath so sharp it nearly burned. This was not merely another position. It was a final chance. She adjusted the collar of her dark wool dress, the fabric rough but well kept, and tucked a strand of auburn brown hair beneath her modest bonnet. Her locket, the one thing her mother had left her, nestled beneath layers of linen and determination. When the heavy door opened, the air that met her was warm, but laced with the weight of silence. "Miss Hartwell," announced Mrs. Green, the housekeeper, in a voice as starched as her collar. "You're expected. This way." Lucinda offered a polite nod and stepped inside. Her gaze swept over the marble entry hall, where no laughter echoed, no muddy boots disturbed the floor. The banister gleamed, untouched. Everything was beautiful and lifeless. "The children are upstairs," said Mrs. Green. "You'll find them spirited. No one has lasted more than a month." Lucinda didn't flinch. "Children seldom misbehave without reason." The housekeeper's brow arched. "You may regret that kindness." With each creaking step up the grand staircase, Lucinda felt the mansion watching her. Portraits of solemn ancestors peered down from gilded frames, eyes seeming to whisper warnings. The second-floor corridor stretched long and silent until the sound of running footsteps shattered the stillness. A wooden block hurtled down the hallway, striking the wall beside her. Laughter followed, high-pitched and wicked. "Miss Hartwell," called a boy's voice, dry with mockery. "I do hope you can read. Our last governess couldn't." Henry Ashford stood at the threshold of the nursery, 10 years old and tall for his age, with sharp features and dark chestnut hair that fell across one eye. He held the door with one hand and a toy soldier in the other, poised like a general. Margaret, the middle child, hovered behind him, 8 years old, pale and slender, with a crown of soft curls and wary green eyes. She said nothing, but her expression studied Lucinda as one might a cipher. At her feet sat Samuel, no older than 5, clinging to a stuffed rabbit with one hand and launching blocks with the other. "Good morning," Lucinda said gently. "I am Miss Hartwell, and I am very glad to meet you." Samuel answered by flinging a block directly at her boots. Lucinda did not flinch. She knelt beside him, eye to eye. "That was quite a throw. Do you always greet guests that way?" The boy blinked. The block in his hand wavered, uncertain. Margaret tilted her head, curious. Henry scowled. "You'll be gone by Thursday," he muttered. "They all leave." Lucinda rose to her feet slowly. "Then we shall make the most of today." She moved through the room with calm certainty, opening curtains to let pale winter light in. Dust danced in the air, and toys lay scattered like battlefield remnants. She set her bag down beside the fireplace and removed her gloves with quiet purpose. From the hallway, Mrs. Green watched with folded arms. The housekeeper's mouth was a straight line, her eyes calculating. "They don't need tenderness, Miss Hartwell. They need obedience." Lucinda turned, her voice still soft but unwavering. "They need someone who will not leave." The door closed behind her with a slow click. In another wing of the house, Charles Ashford stood at his office window, watching the sleet gather in silver sheets across the city. His reflection blurred against the glass, the sharp line of his jaw tight with thought. He had not gone to greet the new nanny. It was better that way. Distance protected the order he had built from grief. And yet, from deep within the mansion, a child's laugh echoed faintly. A sound barely heard. A sound that did not belong. He turned away from the window, but his hand lingered on the sill, as if remembering how to listen. The morning sun rose pale and reluctant over New York City in the winter of 1883, casting a faint wash of gold across the frosted windows of the Ashford mansion. Inside those walls, silence lingered like a guest who had overstayed. It travelled through corridors lined with portraits, settled upon velvet carpets, and hovered above the polished banister as though afraid to disturb the weight of grief that clung to every surface. Lucinda Hartwell felt it the moment she awoke. It wrapped itself around the nursery door like a warning and followed her steps as she prepared for another day in a house that refused to breathe. She entered the nursery quietly, as if the room itself might shatter under too much sound. Henry was already dressed, his shirt tucked with military precision into his wool trousers, his boots polished to a shine. He sat at the small desk by the window with his back impossibly straight, studying a geography book, as though the fate of the world depended upon his memorization of maps. He did not look up. Lucinda offered a gentle, "Good morning, Henry." His jaw tightened, a small sign most would have missed. "It is morning, Miss Hartwell. That is all." He spoke as a child determined to grow up too quickly, as though age were a race he intended to win through sheer force of will. Even his posture spoke of burdens no boy of 10 should feel. Lucinda watched him for a moment, sensing the unspoken question behind his guarded tone. "How long will you last? How long before you leave, like the others?" Before she could attempt conversation, a soft rustle drew her attention. Margaret sat on the rug beside the hearth, hugging her knees. In her lap rested a small notebook of drawing paper, its edges worn with use. A coloured pencil was already poised between her fingers even before Lucinda greeted her. "Good morning, Margaret," Lucinda whispered, kneeling beside her. Margaret looked up with pale green eyes that held an echo of winter itself, quiet, watchful, yearning. "Good morning," she murmured, the words almost lost beneath the crackling fire. Samuel, however, announced his presence in a far less delicate manner. He burst from behind the toy chest, nearly tripping on the scattered wooden animals as he ran straight toward Lucinda. His small hands latched around her skirt as though he were clinging to the edge of safety. "I dreamed the house was falling," he said breathlessly. Everything was shaking. Lucinda steadied him, smoothing a curl from his forehead. "It was only a dream, sweetheart." "It felt real," he insisted, pressing his face into the fabric of her dress. "Dreams often do," she answered softly, "but I am here now." Samuel's grip tightened, a silent declaration of the fear he could not fully articulate. Grief had no structure in a child that young. It came in waves, tantrums, nightmares, sudden clinging, and Lucinda felt the undercurrent of all three tugging at him. Mrs. Green entered with her customary stiffness, carrying a tray of porridge bowls arranged with perfect symmetry. She placed them on the table without a sound. "They have been awake for hours," she said. "It is best to begin lessons immediately. Structure is the only thing that keeps this house from falling apart." Lucinda thanked her politely, though she sensed what the housekeeper did not voice. Structure was not enough. She had lived long enough within sorrow to recognize that it needed warmth as much as order, reassurance as much as rules. During their morning studies, she observed Henry's need for control. He answered questions with precision, but tightened his grip on his pencil each time Samuel made a noise. He corrected Margaret's pronunciation and bristled whenever Lucinda attempted to gently redirect him. He was a child determined to outrun his own powerlessness. Margaret drifted between concentration and silence, her gaze often slipping toward the window as if searching for something lost beyond the snow-dusted street. When Lucinda placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, the girl didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch a fraction of an inch, so slight it could have been imagined, yet Lucinda felt it entirely. Samuel's confusion was the most visible. At one moment, he scribbled bright colors in his workbook with wholehearted passion, and at the next, he knocked over his cup, startled by thoughts that ran too fast for his small body to contain. After lessons, Lucinda encouraged them to rest. Only then did she allow herself to step into the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and warm scent of leather. She searched for books that might soothe them, stories of hope, bravery, beginnings, but instead stumbled upon hushed voices in the corner behind the tall reading desk. She was too beautiful for her own good, one maid whispered, and too foolish, replied another. They say she had secrets. Not so loud, warned the first. If Mr. Ashford heard. Lucinda remained still, obscured from view, yet unable to step away. A name drifted in the air like a chill. Eliza Ashford, the mother of the children, the woman whose shadow stretched across every corner of the house. She argued with him the night before the crash, the maid continued. Some swear she left the house in tears. And the carriage. Hush, that is not for us to repeat. Lucinda stepped back before they noticed her, heart beating faster. Rumors traveled like wildfire in grand households, but the pain behind these whispers felt real. Too real. Later, as dusk settled over the mansion, the children gathered in the nursery once more. Henry pretended to read, but kept glancing toward the locked door of the west wing. Margaret traced circles in her sketchbook, her pencil dragging slowly, thoughtfully. Samuel lay curled on the hearthrug, holding his rabbit tight. Lucinda approached Henry. Would you like to read aloud? No, he replied instantly. You will hear me stumble. I will only hear you try, she said gently. His eyes flickered, betraying the longing he worked so hard to conceal. Before he could respond, the nursery door opened. Mrs. Green's voice, as sharp as the crease in her apron, broke the stillness. Mr. Ashford requests to see you downstairs, Miss Hartwell. Lucinda felt the children stiffen. Even Samuel sat upright. Is he angry? Henry asked, his tone brittle. I do not know, Mrs. Green replied, but he rarely summons anyone without good reason. Lucinda followed her down the stairway, her heartbeat echoing like distant footsteps. The mansion deepened in shadow the farther they went, until only a few gas lamps flickered along the corridor. Charles Ashford stood at the far end, his posture straight, his gaze distant. He wore a dark wool coat, the collar turned slightly, as though he had just stepped in from the cold. His hair, streaked with silver at the temples, caught the faint light. He looked both formidable and fragile, as if carved from stone, but warmed by the faintest breath. Miss Hartwell, he said, his voice low. Mr. Ashford. Their words collided with the quiet around them, charged with something neither dared name. You have changed the schedule, he said. I was informed the children were taken outdoors this morning. Lucinda met his gaze evenly. Yes, fresh air is important. His jaw tensed. You should have consulted me. I did not wish to disturb you during work. You are here to follow instructions, he said, his tone turning colder, not to impose your own. And yet, Lucinda replied softly, the children responded well. He stepped closer, not enough to breach propriety, but enough that she felt the pulse of his presence. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the weight of emotion in his eyes, something hollow, aching, and deeply human. Do not overstep, he murmured. Lucinda raised her chin. If kindness is overstepping, then I will continue to do so. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The air thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. His gaze lingered on her face, not with admiration nor anger, but with a searching intensity that felt like a hand brushing along the edge of her soul. At last he stepped back, restraining something within himself. "Good evening, Miss Hartwell. Good evening, Mr. Ashford." He turned away before she did, but she sensed he felt the moment as deeply as she had. When she returned to the nursery, the children crowded around her. Henry tried to appear indifferent, Margaret clung to Lucinda's skirt, and Samuel threw his arms around her waist. "You came back," he whispered. Lucinda sank to her knees and drew them close. "I told you I would." For the first time, the shadows of the nursery shifted, not disappearing but softening, as though acknowledging that the light she carried would not be easily extinguished. And in that moment, Lucinda knew one truth with unshakable clarity. This house did not need merely a nanny, it needed a heart, and she had come to give it one. Winter settled more firmly over New York City as the days passed, draping the avenues of Fifth Avenue in white and softening even the sharpest corners of the grand mansions that lined its path. Inside the Ashford home, the cold persisted, but it no longer ruled. There were mornings now when a faint melody drifted under the nursery door, hesitant and delicate, as though testing whether the house would permit such warmth. Lucinda Hartwell sat at the small, upright piano in the corner, her fingers coaxing gentle chords from keys long untouched. Margaret sat beside her, legs tucked neatly under her wool skirt, eyes shining with silent wonder. Henry stood a few paces away, pretending to examine a geography map pinned to the wall, though the tilt of his head revealed he was listening. Samuel lay on the rug, with his rabbit nestled against his cheek, humming softly in imitation of the tune. Lucinda watched them with a tenderness she held close to her heart. Music, she knew, had a special power. Children responded to it long before they could name their emotions. And on this cold morning, as she played a melody from her childhood church, she witnessed something remarkable. Margaret lifted her small hands and gently pressed a key of her own, the note trembling, imperfect, but real. "Very good," Lucinda whispered. Margaret's cheeks flushed, and she pulled her hands back quickly, but the spark had already ignited. Henry turned slightly, as if he wanted to scold his sister for breaking the silence, yet he said nothing. Instead, he moved closer to the piano, resting a hand on its polished surface as though grounding himself. The room felt different, lighter, warmer, as if the weight hanging over the nursery had shifted, making space for something new, something hopeful. By mid-morning, snow had begun to fall in soft, generous flakes that drifted past the tall windows. Samuel pressed his face to the glass. "Miss Hartwell, can we go outside?" he pleaded, breath fogging the pain. Lucinda looked toward Mrs. Green, who hovered by the door with her usual stern expression. "The children rarely go out in weather like this," the housekeeper warned. "It is untidy and cold, and they need fresh air," Lucinda said gently. "Just for a little while." Before Mrs. Green could answer, Henry stepped forward, chin lifted in quiet defiance. "Please." The word surprised everyone, even Henry himself. It was the first plea he had offered in Lucinda's presence, and perhaps the first in much longer. Mrs. Green sighed heavily but stepped aside. Outside, the world was transformed. Snow clung to the wrought-iron gate and crowned the bare branches of the chestnut trees. Lucinda bundled the children in wool coats and scarves, adjusting each button and knot with care. Samuel slipped his gloves on backward, causing Margaret to stifle a laugh, the kind of sound that had nearly disappeared from her life. They crossed the street and entered the wide expanse of Central Park, where silence stretched wide and white as far as the eye could see. Henry kicked at the snow experimentally, before allowing a rare smile to break across his face. Samuel immediately flung himself into a snowdrift with delighted abandon, giggling as cold flakes clung to his dark curls. Margaret walked beside Lucinda, her hand slipping into the Nanny's with an instinctive trust that made Lucinda's heart ache. The children played freely, laughing as Samuel tried to build a lopsided fort, while Henry determined the proper architectural structure for it. Margaret gathered pine cones, arranging them in neat rows like tiny treasures. Lucinda watched them with a mix of joy and sorrow, reminded that childhood was meant to be lived outdoors, in laughter, in fresh air, not stifled behind locked doors and ghostly memories. She lifted her gaze and froze. Across the park, Charles Ashford stood watching. He had not approached, nor called out, but something in his posture suggested he had been standing there for longer than she realized. His dark overcoat blended with the trunks of the trees, and snow dotted his shoulders like pale constellations. His expression was unreadable, sculpted by shadows and memory, but his eyes, those piercing grey-blue eyes, were fixed on his children. Lucinda felt her breath catch. Charles looked less like the unapproachable magnate who ran empires, and more like a man witnessing strangers occupy the lives of those he loved. For a brief moment, the pain he kept locked away flickered across his face, raw and unguarded. Then, realizing she had seen him, he straightened and offered a curt nod before turning away, disappearing into the trees as quietly as he had appeared. Lucinda felt no triumph in the moment, only a deep, bittersweet ache. By early afternoon, the children grew weary and content, their cheeks flushed with color. When they returned to the mansion, their footsteps echoed less harshly across the marble floor. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum, not entirely. That night, Lucinda helped Margaret into her nightgown, smoothing her hair with gentle fingers. The girl hesitated before whispering, "Miss Hartwell, will you stay?" "For tonight?" Lucinda asked softly. "No," Margaret said, eyes wide and unguarded. "For always." Lucinda felt her throat tighten. "I will stay as long as I can." Margaret nodded slowly, but the hope in her gaze pierced Lucinda deep. The sound of carriage wheels outside broke the quiet. Moments later, a new presence swept into the mansion. Eleanor Ashford. She arrived in a swirl of plum silk and fox fur, her gloved hands graceful but commanding, her expression sharpened by years of social mastery. Her silver blonde hair was styled in an elegant chignon, not a strand daring to escape. She kissed her brother on the cheek with calculated affection. "Charlie," she said, voice smooth as glass, "I have returned sooner than expected. Boston became quite dull without your company." Charles offered a tired smile, the kind he reserved for social obligation. "Welcome home, Eleanor." Her eyes drifted upward toward the stairwell. "I hear the new nanny arrived. I trust she is ordinary enough not to attract attention." Charles stiffened. "She is competent." "Competence is overrated," Eleanor replied. "What matters is appearance." Lucinda, listening from the top landing, felt the words like a cold draft. Eleanor's gaze swept upward, landing on her with immediate judgment. "You must be Miss Hartwell," she called. "Do come down. I prefer to meet those who will be near the children." Lucinda descended the stairs calmly, each step measured. Eleanor's eyes traveled from her simple dress to her modest hairstyle, to the faint flush on her cheeks. A small, satisfied smirk formed on her lips. "Yes," Eleanor said, voice dripping with condescension. "You look precisely as I imagined. Fresh-faced, country-bred, uncomplicated." Lucinda inclined her head. "Good evening, Mrs. Ashford." "Widow Ashford," Eleanor corrected. "Formality is essential in this household." Charles exhaled quietly, as if weary already. "Eleanor," but she raised a hand to silence him. "I am sure we will speak more tomorrow, Miss Hartwell. I expect order, discipline, and discretion from those who care for the children." Her tone hardened. "Above all, I expect loyalty to this family's reputation." Lucinda did not waver. "My loyalty is to Henry, Margaret, and Samuel." Eleanor's expression soured, a hairline crack of displeasure spreading across her perfect demeanor. "We shall see," she replied. The next day, tension crept through the house as Eleanor re-established her presence. She scrutinized the children's attire, questioned the staff's routines, and inspected the nursery as though grime might leap from the corners to offend her. She raised a brow at Margaret's modest drawings, frowned at Henry's scuffed boots, and muttered something about Samuel's lack of refinement. Lucinda stood firm. When Eleanor found them in the music room, Lucinda playing a gentle tune while Margaret practiced her scales, the widow stopped at the threshold. "Music?" she asked with thinly veiled disdain. "Is that truly necessary?" Lucinda kept her voice calm. "It soothes them." Eleanor waved her hand. "We must raise them to be proper Ashfords, not sentimental musicians." Margaret's fingers faltered on the keys. Lucinda placed a steadying hand on her back. "Sensitivity is not a flaw," she said quietly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Bold words for a governess. Lucinda met her gaze. "Because they are true." That evening, as the house prepared for sleep, something extraordinary happened. Charles Ashford paused outside the nursery. He heard faint notes drifting through the door. Margaret, practicing alone. And then, unexpectedly, incredibly, the sound that followed stole the breath from his lungs. A laugh, a soft, bright, startled laugh, as if Margaret had momentarily forgotten the sorrow she carried. Charles closed his eyes. For over a year, he had not heard that sound. It reached into the hollow part of his chest and stirred something long dormant. When he opened his eyes again, the corridor seemed less dark. Downstairs, Eleanor sipped her evening tea, unaware that the walls of the Ashford mansion had shifted ever so slightly. And upstairs, Lucinda Hartwell sat beside the sleeping children, unaware that the man listening outside the door was no longer unmoved. The house was beginning to breathe again, and she was the reason why. It was the kind of cold that silenced the earth, the kind of stillness that gathered beneath stone arches and crept through the joints of a house long unaccustomed to warmth. But within the Ashford mansion, change continued its quiet bloom, unnoticed by those who had come to expect only silence. The garden had lain dormant for months, hidden beneath a shroud of snow and frost, its fountains frozen mid-spill and hedgerows cloaked in white. But that morning, Margaret sat by the tall conservatory window, her sketchbook on her lap, fingers dusted with charcoal. Lucinda had placed a folded blanket around her shoulders, knowing the sun alone would not suffice. "What do you see?" Lucinda asked softly, standing just behind her. Margaret tilted her head, her pale green eyes scanning the winter landscape. "It looks asleep, but it's only waiting." Lucinda smiled. "Even in winter the roots remember." Margaret pressed her pencil to the page and began sketching the gnarled branches of a rosebush, the curve of an iron bench nearly buried by snow. She drew slowly, deliberately, her confidence returning with each stroke. It had taken weeks of patient encouragement, but Lucinda knew that when a child dared to create, she was beginning to heal. In the adjoining room, Henry paced. The boy had recently developed a habit of carrying a folded scrap of newspaper in his breast pocket, a cutout of train routes and railway expansion projects. He pored over them as if decoding the future. Lucinda entered and sat across from him, waiting without pressing. After a long pause, he spoke. "Do you think it's foolish to want to build something?" "Not at all," she replied. "Dreams give us direction, even when the world feels like it's spinning in circles." He looked at her then, really looked, with something new in his eyes, something raw. "I want to be like my father," he admitted, "but I don't know if I like who he is." Lucinda's heart stirred, but she spoke with care. "Then be like the part of him that remembers how to listen. I believe that part is still there." The boy folded the paper again, slipping it into his pocket. His nod was small, but it carried weight. Samuel had grown into Lucinda's shadow. Wherever she went, he followed, bounding down the halls in mismatched socks, trailing her skirts like a second hem. He refused to sleep without her singing, no longer cried when startled, but clung to her hand with solemn trust. It was Charles who noticed it first. One evening, after the children had been tucked in and the house dimmed to candlelight, Lucinda descended the stairs to find him in the conservatory. Snow fell outside in thick, lazy flurries, and the glass panes were streaked with condensation. Charles stood with a brandy in hand, his silhouette outlined in warm amber light, framed by the ivy-wrapped windows. She hesitated, but he gestured for her to enter. "It's the only room that still remembers her," he said without turning. Lucinda stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing the tile floor. "The garden?" He nodded. "Eliza loved it here, even in the cold. She said winter made the soul honest." Lucinda didn't answer. She simply stood beside him, watching the snow gather on the stone path. "You've changed the house," he said quietly. "The children changed me first," she replied. He turned toward her, and the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. His gaze fell to her hand, gloved in wool, resting lightly on the iron balustrade. His fingers twitched at his side, as if drawn forward by instinct alone. For one breathless moment he reached for her, a motion half completed, but he stopped. The distance held. "They speak of you constantly," he said, voice low. "Margaret draws you in the margins of her books. Samuel asked me yesterday if he could marry you when he grows up." Lucinda laughed softly, her breath fogging the air. "I hope I told him that would be quite the wait." Charles allowed a smile, brief but genuine, the kind that faded too quickly. "Eleanor is planning a ball," he said suddenly. Lucinda turned to him. "A ball?" He nodded. "For the season. She believes I must be seen again, properly, that the family must resume its place in society." Lucinda said nothing. She could already see the implications unfolding. "She wishes to invite certain ladies of standing," he added, not meeting her eyes. "Of course she does," Lucinda murmured. The silence stretched, thick with understanding. She did not need to be told where she belonged, or rather where she did not. He turned back to the glass, his voice tight. "Eleanor means well, in her way. I'm sure she believes that." He looked at her again, searching her face for bitterness, but there was only quiet resolve. "Good night, Mr. Ashford," she said. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." As she left, she did not glance back. Upstairs, Eleanor stood outside the nursery, arms folded. "You're very fond of that room," she said when Lucinda approached. "It is where the children sleep," Lucinda replied. "And yet," Eleanor continued, "you seem to believe it is your kingdom." Lucinda met her gaze steadily. "It is their sanctuary." Eleanor arched a brow. "You speak as if affection grants authority." Lucinda did not blink. "Sometimes it does." Eleanor stepped closer. Her voice dropped. "Do not mistake kindness for victory, Miss Hartwell. The world does not reward sentimentality. It rewards position, names, bloodlines." Lucinda's voice was a whisper, but it cut clear. "Then the world is mistaken." She walked past Eleanor without waiting for permission, and the house, though quiet, seemed to sigh in agreement. The sound of hammers, ladders, and sweeping brooms echoed through the once quiet halls of the Ashford mansion. For days, the rhythm of childhood laughter had been replaced by the persistent thrum of preparation. Winter had deepened its hold outside, but within, the hearths burned brighter, the servants moved faster, and the walls gleamed with fresh polish. The winter ball was upon them. Eleanor Ashford orchestrated the event like a general preparing for battle. She oversaw every floral arrangement, every menu revision, and every seating chart with an iron gaze that left no room for compromise. The guest list was a carefully curated web of New York's finest names: judges, bankers, heiresses, dowagers, and most notably, a widowed woman of impeccable lineage, Mrs. Juliet Vale. "She is elegant, well-positioned, and childless," Eleanor noted aloud one afternoon as she examined the list in the drawing room. "Perfectly suited for a man of Charles's reputation." Lucinda had entered just in time to hear those words, her arms full of folded linens. She paused, not because she feared Eleanor's schemes, but because she recognized their power. Eleanor understood the language of society, and in that world, Lucinda was a ghost with no name. By the time the chandeliers were dusted and the musicians had been paid, the children were restless. They watched with growing confusion as their home transformed into something glittering and unfamiliar. "Where will we be during the ball?" Margaret asked as she helped Lucinda button her dress. "Upstairs," Lucinda replied gently. "In the nursery." Henry frowned. "But it's our house too." Lucinda touched his shoulder. "Just for one evening we will let them borrow it." Samuel sulked. "I don't want to stay upstairs." Lucinda knelt to meet his gaze. "I will come check on you throughout the night, I promise." The night arrived in a flurry of snowfall and footmen. Gaslight bathed the marble floors in gold, and the entryway filled with the scent of rose oil and pine. Carriages lined the street, their passengers stepping into the house with practiced grace. Lucinda stood at the top of the staircase for a brief moment, watching as the guests poured in, cloaked in silk and velvet and jewels that caught the firelight. She had never seen anything so dazzling. In her room, she wore her simplest dress, a slate blue wool with a cream collar and the faintest embroidery at the cuffs. Her hair was pinned back in its usual low knot, a few strands curled from the warmth of the fire. She had not dressed for admiration, only for dignity. From the hallway, she heard music swell from the grand ballroom. She descended part way, enough to glimpse the edges of the festivities without being seen. The sight struck her like a chord. Charles stood near the entrance to the ballroom, his figure sharply tailored in black. Beside him was Mrs. Vale, whose gown shimmered like moonlight. She touched his arm and laughed, and he, ever composed, inclined his head with polite interest. Lucinda turned away. Back upstairs, the children watched the snow from the window. Margaret was curled in a chair with a storybook. Henry tapped impatiently at the windowsill. Samuel had fallen asleep in Lucinda's bed, clutching a stuffed bear she had repaired just the day before. She stayed with them, reading softly until Margaret dozed, and Henry finally stopped asking questions. Then she slipped away to check on the servants. Downstairs, the ball was in full swing. Music floated through the corridors, accompanied by the low hum of conversation and the occasional peal of laughter. Eleanor moved among the guests with ease, placing smiles and suggestions where they were most strategic. Lucinda paused in the hallway to collect a forgotten tray. As she turned, she heard voices drifting from behind the salon doors. "Is she the governess?" someone asked. "Yes. Charles took her in after that scandal with the tutor. Some say she's more than a governess. Well, she certainly thinks she belongs." Lucinda did not linger to hear more. Back in the nursery, all was still, but the silence did not last. A loud thump shook the floorboards, then a shriek. Lucinda raced down the hallway to find Henry and Margaret on the stair landing. Samuel sprawled at the foot of the stairs, tears in his eyes. "We wanted to see Papa," Margaret whispered. "Just for a moment." Samuel clung to Lucinda, sobbing. His leg was scraped, nothing broken, but the sound had drawn attention. Voices rose below. Footsteps approached, and then they appeared. Eleanor, followed by guests, then Charles. Lucinda stood, cradling Samuel against her chest. "I told you to keep them upstairs," Eleanor hissed. Lucinda's face burned. "They only wanted to see their father. And what they accomplished," Eleanor said sharply, "is humiliating him." Charles's gaze was unreadable. One guest murmured, "Quite unorthodox, letting the children wander." Juliet Vale looked at Lucinda with a smile too kind to be sincere. "It must be difficult," she said sweetly, "to keep them disciplined." Lucinda wished she could disappear. Without a word, Charles stepped forward. He took Samuel gently from her arms and handed him to the nursemaid. Then he turned to Eleanor. "Ensure that children are cared for," he said coldly. Lucinda met his eyes for the briefest second. And then, before anyone could speak again, she walked away. The whispers followed her all the way up the stairs. Eleanor appeared at her door before midnight. "You must leave," she said. Lucinda did not answer. "You've caused enough damage, and I will not let you endanger the family's name any further." She turned and vanished down the hall. Lucinda stood alone. Below, the music resumed. The ball continued. and somewhere beyond the candlelit windows, snow fell without a sound. The snow that had danced so elegantly on the night of the ball turned to ice the following morning. Icicles clung to the wrought-iron gates, and a low, biting wind threaded through the shutters of the Ashford mansion. Inside, the silence had shifted. It was not the peaceful hush of children at rest, nor the distant murmur of servants at work. It was the silence that follows after something sacred has been broken. Lucinda Hartwell stood at the foot of her narrow bed, her suitcase half-packed. The modest belongings she had arrived with now felt heavier, not because of their physical weight, but because they carried the gravity of all she was preparing to leave behind. A worn book of poetry, a locket that had belonged to her mother, and a handkerchief embroidered by Margaret only a week prior. Her fingers paused over that handkerchief. She had not slept. How could she? The memory of Eleanor's words, the sting of the guest's judgment, and the look on Charles's face as he turned away from her, all haunted her like a bitter refrain. She had made a promise to the children, but promises, she reminded herself, were not always enough in a world ruled by appearances. Downstairs, the house creaked beneath the pressure of unspoken tension. The children, usually lively by morning, had not emerged from the nursery. Even the staff moved with softened steps, avoiding Lucinda's eyes. Margaret had cried herself to sleep. Henry had refused to speak. Samuel had asked in a whisper if he had ruined everything. Lucinda had not known how to answer. In the drawing-room, Eleanor sat with her morning tea, poised and victorious. Charles stood by the window, his back to her, watching the city emerge from beneath its icy veil. His hands were clasped tightly behind him, the knuckles white. "It had to be done," Eleanor said with manufactured calm. "You cannot afford even the appearance of scandal." Charles did not respond. "The children will recover. They always do." "And what if I do not?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Eleanor set her teacup down with a delicate clink. "You are not some grieving poet, Charles. You are a businessman, a father. You must think of your legacy." He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Legacy," he repeated. "Is that what this house has become to you? A monument to control?" "A fortress," she corrected, "against ruin, which is precisely what she will bring." "She brought them back to life," he said quietly. "Do you not see that?" Eleanor stood. "Your sentiment is admirable, but it is not useful." Charles said nothing more. He left the room in silence. That evening, as the house dimmed into early twilight, he wandered into the nursery. The door creaked softly as he entered. Henry sat near the window, staring at the darkening sky. Margaret was curled on the settee, clutching her sketchbook but not drawing. Samuel sat in the middle of the floor, his face buried in his hands. None of them looked up. It was Margaret who broke the silence. She said goodbye. Charles stepped further in. "When?" "This morning, but she didn't mean it. Not really." He walked to Margaret and sat beside her. Her body was stiff with unshed tears. He reached out and gently took the sketchbook from her lap. When he opened it, a folded sheet slipped out and fluttered to the floor. He picked it up. It was a drawing of the four of them, himself, Margaret, Henry, Samuel, and Lucinda, seated in the middle. He stared at it for a long time. Then, wordlessly, he rose and left. He found her in the servants' corridor, a wool cloak draped over her shoulders, her hands trembling as she tied the strings of her bonnet. She did not hear him at first. "Are you going to say goodbye?" Lucinda turned, startled. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. "I already did," she replied. "They were asleep. They were pretending." The truth hung between them, heavy and painful. "You should hate me," he said. Lucinda met his gaze. "I don't, but you are leaving. Because I have no place here. You have their hearts," he said. "And mine." Her breath caught. "Please don't." "Why?" "Because I will believe you, and I cannot afford to." Before he could answer, a voice echoed from the front door. "Sir, you'll want to see this." The butler held a newspaper. The headline was bold, unmissable. governess or mistress. Whispers surround Charles Ashford's household. Charles read the article in silence. The words were venomous, accusing Lucinda of seduction, of manipulating the affections of both father and children to secure a place in the household. Lucinda saw her name in print and staggered back. "Who would write such things?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Warren Hale," Charles said, his mouth hardening. "A man I refused to do business with last winter. He wanted a controlling share in the Pennsylvania line. I declined." Lucinda pressed a hand to her chest. "He used me to punish you." Charles looked at her with something deeper than rage. "He used you because I made you vulnerable." She turned away. "It doesn't matter. The damage is done. It matters to me." But Lucinda no longer trusted her voice. That night the children refused supper. Margaret sat at her window, watching the street in silence. Samuel asked Mrs. Green if Lucinda would ever come back. Henry wrote a letter he did not send, tucked it into his pillow, and folded himself under the covers like a soldier in retreat. Charles remained in his study, the drawing still in his coat pocket. He unfolded it again under the light of a single lamp. His daughter's pencil strokes were clumsy but earnest. He traced Lucinda's outline with his thumb. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Not of failure, but of loneliness, and of what it would mean to let her go. Outside, the city turned its back on the scandal with the cruel precision of the elite. Inside, a man stood between duty and devotion, watching the fire in the hearth burn lower. And upstairs, 3 children waited for a door that would not open. Not yet. The city awoke to scandal. Printed in bold ink and wrapped in the morning edition, the story made its way from the hands of newsboys to the drawing rooms of New York's most fastidious society. The headline was merciless, the details lurid, and at the center of it all, Charles Ashford and the woman who had dared to warm his broken household. "Governess turned temptress," one paper read. "Tycoon, ensnared by servant," another proclaimed. Lucinda Hartwell's name was no longer hers. It had been taken, twisted, dragged through parlors and tea salons and church pews, reshaped into something unrecognizable. In the drawing room of the Ashford home, silence pressed against the walls like a second storm. A copy of the article lay on the table, its pages trembling slightly in the draught. Mrs. Green stood by the hearth, lips pressed into a firm line. "You must consider your safety," she said. "There are those who will not be kind." Lucinda sat on the settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face composed but pale. "I have done nothing wrong," she replied softly. "That has never stopped them," the housekeeper said. Her voice cracked just once. Upstairs, the children had learned more quickly than anyone expected. Henry had found the paper first. He had not spoken a word since. Margaret had withdrawn so completely that not even her pencils could coax her back, and Samuel wept. He followed Lucinda everywhere, clinging to her skirts, hiding behind doors, refusing to be left alone for even a moment. By noon, 3 callers had already cancelled their luncheons with Eleanor. A bouquet sent by Mrs. Vale arrived with no card. Charles remained behind the doors of his study, unreadable, unreachable. By late afternoon, Lucinda opened her trunk. She packed slowly, not because she wanted to stay, but because she couldn't quite bear to leave. There were footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn. "Don't go," Henry said. Lucinda turned. His face was red with fury. "You didn't do anything," he added. "No," she agreed, "but sometimes people don't care about truth, Henry. They care about comfort, and lies are often more comfortable. Then they're fools," she smiled faintly. "They are frightened." Margaret came in without speaking. She walked to the trunk and placed a ribbon-tied bundle inside. It was her sketchbook. "For you," she said. Lucinda knelt, touched her cheek. "I will treasure it." Samuel's voice came from the doorframe. "But you said you would stay forever." Lucinda opened her arms. He ran into them. She held them all, as tightly as her arms could manage, before gently letting go. When they were gone, Charles appeared. He looked as though he had not slept. His waistcoat was misbuttoned, his hair less polished than usual, and his eyes were no longer cold. "I will make a statement," he said. Lucinda rose. "It will not change their minds." "It may not," he said, "but it will show my children what courage looks like." And so he did. That evening, Charles Ashford walked into the offices of the New York Gazette and dictated his own words. He spoke of honor, of the integrity of a woman who had restored life to his family. He named the gossip for what it was: vindictive retaliation from a man whose business interests he had rejected. The editor, stunned, published the letter in full. But it did not undo the damage. Church matrons whispered louder. Eleanor, cornered at an opera box, was asked if she would be seeking a more appropriate governess. And Lucinda, whose name now rang through society's drawing rooms, returned to her quarters in silence and finished packing. She planned to leave before dawn. That night, Charles did not return to his study. Instead, he walked beyond the house, beyond the gates, through the frozen paths that led to the private crypt where his wife was buried. The snow crunched beneath his boots. The lantern he carried cast long, quivering shadows. He unlocked the gate and stepped inside. Eliza's name was carved in white marble, untouched by time. Charles stood there for a long time. "I kept you on a pedestal," he said aloud. "And in doing so, I let you become a myth. I let the children live inside your silence. I lived there too. I let guilt speak for you." The cold air pressed against him. He looked down at the floor. "They say you left in tears that night, that you had secrets. I believed them." He placed a hand against the stone. "But I remember your laughter, and I remember the light in your eyes when you first held Margaret. You were not a ghost. You were real, and flawed, and kind." He exhaled a long breath. "I loved you, but I cannot love your absence forever." He stood in silence. Then he turned and walked back into the night. As the snow fell behind him, Charles Ashford left something buried in that crypt beyond his wife. He left the lie, and in its place, he carried something else, a truth he could no longer deny. The city slept under a blanket of white. Snow fell gently, as if to hush the noise of the world, as if it too sensed that something fragile and irrevocable hung in the balance. Fifth Avenue glittered under the glow of gaslights, and the Ashford mansion, tall and silent, stood like a breath held too long. Inside, Lucinda Hartwell tied the last ribbon of her bonnet with fingers that did not tremble, only because she refused to let them. Her trunk sat by the door, closed now, heavy not with clothing, but with memories. The scent of lavender clung to the hem of her coat. In her pocket, folded 3 times, was Margaret's last drawing. She had not cried. Not when she kissed Samuel's sleeping brow. Not when Henry, pretending not to watch her, stood stiff as a soldier at the window. Not even when she stepped over the threshold of the nursery and whispered goodbye to the room that had become a heartbeat in the stillness of her life. But now, as the snow thickened, she turned one last time toward the stairs. And there he stood, Charles. He was not dressed as a man prepared for business, nor as a gentleman of society. He wore a simple coat, his scarf forgotten. Snow glistened on his shoulders. His eyes were darker in the low light, but they held something Lucinda had never seen in him before. He did not speak immediately. She lowered her gaze. "I was not going to wake you," she said. "It seemed kinder." He stepped closer. "Do you believe I care about kindness, Lucinda?" She flinched at the use of her name. He had never spoken it aloud in her presence. Not like that. He exhaled. "I've lived in this house for years, surrounded by silence. I let grief become law. I let fear raise my children." She shook her head, eyes shining but steady. "You did what you could." "I did what was easy," he said. "What was expected, until you arrived." She turned away. "Please don't say this now, not when I'm already leaving," he finished. Silence. He looked up the stairs. "Come with me." "I can't." "You can. One more time. He did not wait for her answer. He walked toward the nursery. And something in her heart rose up and followed. The room was dim. Only the fire glowed, casting flickering shadows across the floor. The quiet was full of presence, of memory. Charles turned to face her. "You changed this house," he said. "Not the curtains, not the children's schedules. You changed the bones of it, the breath, the soul." Lucinda swallowed. "I was only ever a guest." "No." He stepped closer. "You are the reason it feels like home again." She wanted to believe him. But the memory of laughter turned cruel, of whispers in corridors, of newspaper ink that could not be unwritten. Those things clung to her. "They will never let me forget what they've said about me." "Then let them speak," he said. "Let them fill their halls with venom. I'll build a house that sings louder than their hatred." Her breath caught. "You make it sound easy." "It won't be," he said, voice raw, "but I won't do it without you." And then they heard it. A soft scuffle, a giggle, the rustle of fabric. Margaret stepped out from behind the curtain, her hair unbraided, a bundle in her arms. "I didn't want you to go," she whispered. Henry appeared next, holding a book. Samuel stumbled in last, clutching a crumpled drawing and blinking away sleep. One by one, they surrounded Lucinda. Margaret offered the ribbon-wrapped bundle. It was her sketchbook, fuller now than before. Henry placed the book in her hands. It was one of his, with her name penciled on the first page. Samuel pressed the drawing to her chest and looked up with wide, pleading eyes. Charles knelt beside them. "I asked you to stay once as their governess," he said. "But I am not asking you that now." He reached for her hand. "I'm asking you to stay as my wife." Time seemed to still. Lucinda looked down at the children, their faces open, their hearts in their hands. Then she looked at Charles, and what she saw in his eyes, humility, hope, and a love born not of passion but of trust, unlocked something in her that fear had buried. She nodded, not with grandeur, but with truth. "Yes," she said. And in the warmth of the nursery, as snow kissed the windows, the Ashford house breathed again, this time for good. The Sunday edition of the New York Times arrived folded into sharp corners, its ink still fresh, its headline unwavering. Among updates on railway mergers and political whispers, one announcement stood in defiant bold: Charles Ashford to marry former governess Lucinda Hartwell. The household awoke to a storm that morning, though not one of snow. It began with Eleanor's gasp, a sound clipped and sharp as broken glass, echoing from the breakfast parlour. The newspaper trembled in her gloved hand, her knuckles white. Around her, the servants exchanged glances they did not dare hold too long. Upstairs, Lucinda stood at the nursery window, the paper untouched in her hands. Her name printed among the columns did not feel like a triumph. It felt like walking into fire with her chin lifted. She had not asked for the announcement, nor had she objected, but she had read it only once, and then she had folded it carefully and placed it beneath her pillow. Charles had said the world would talk. He had not lied. By noon, invitations were retracted. A visiting cousin cancelled tea. Whispers danced along pews at St. Gregory's before the second bell rang, and Eleanor, unrelenting, set about reviving her social army. She wore steel-grey silk that day, her hat a tower of feathers. She travelled from parlour to drawing-room, from the Ladies' Historical Society to the Garden Club, her smile painted in porcelain and her tongue dipped in vinegar. But no rally formed. No allies answered her call. They had seen the change in Charles. They had seen the transformation of the Ashford home, and they had seen Lucinda. It was not the announcement that weakened Eleanor's grip. It was the air of peace that had settled in a house once ruled by sorrow. That evening, after supper, the confrontation arrived like a duel. Eleanor swept into the study, eyes ablaze. "You've humiliated the family name." Charles stood by the fireplace, a hand resting casually on the mantel. He did not flinch. "I've reclaimed it. You will regret this. You think love can survive gossip? I think truth can, and dignity, and my children's joy." She stared at him, wounded not by his decision, but by the fact that she no longer held sway. Her voice broke only once. She was the help. "She is my future," Charles said. And Eleanor, knowing she was beaten not by scandal but by irrelevance, booked passage to Europe by morning. The news spread fast, but the house remained calm. Henry returned to his books, now with a new lightness to his brow. Margaret sang softly when she thought no one was listening. Samuel traced Lucinda's silhouette as if committing her to memory. At church, silence fell when Lucinda entered, but no one turned her away. One matron, once vocal in her disdain, stepped forward after the service. She extended her hand, said nothing, just met Lucinda's eyes with a quiet nod of respect. It was enough. Letters began to arrive. Most were brief, some cruel. But one, with familiar handwriting and a faint scent of pipe tobacco, arrived from upstate, from her father. "My dearest Lou," it began, "when I was young, I believed the world had rooms for people like us. But you've made a place where none was given, and I've never been prouder to see a Hartwell name placed beside one spoken with such reverence." Lucinda read the letter thrice before pressing it to her chest. Some doors indeed closed, but new ones opened. Those who stayed were not the loudest or the wealthiest, but they were the kindest, the most enduring, the real friends. One twilight in March, just as the crocuses broke through thawing soil, Charles and Lucinda found themselves alone in the garden. The city beyond still breathed with noise and disapproval, but here, in the hush between gaslight and moonlight, there was only the gentle rustle of ivy and the scent of hyacinths. Charles reached for her hand. No gloves, no pretense. He opened her palm and placed there a tiny velvet box. Inside lay a ring, elegant, old, with a thin band of platinum and a pearl surrounded by delicate diamonds. "It belonged to my mother," he said. Lucinda glanced down at the locket she still wore, the one that had held her own mother's picture. She touched it once, gently, then unfastened it. With reverent fingers, Charles removed it. He slipped the ring onto her finger. "It doesn't change who you are," he said. "No," she replied, "but it reminds me of who I'm choosing to be." Their kiss was not urgent, nor was it public. It was a quiet breath shared between two people who had walked through storm and slander and still found each other whole. The night wrapped them in stillness, and the garden, once bare with winter, bloomed around them, slowly, without need for witness. By the time spring painted Fifth Avenue with blossoms and birdsong, the Ashford mansion no longer echoed like a crypt. Its windows were opened each morning, letting sunlight spill onto Persian rugs and polished banisters. Servants no longer whispered in corners, but laughed gently in shared jokes. The home breathed, as if awakening from a long, sorrowful sleep. The nursery was gone. In its place stood a room that felt like the very heart of the house, a cozy library with low shelves of worn books, wooden trains, and watercolor sets, where a brass telescope rested by the window. Margaret's sketches lined one wall in mismatched frames. Henry had engineered a working clock that ticked cheerfully above the hearth. Samuel, never far from Lucinda, had his name stitched on a cushion shaped like a lion. Lucinda moved through the home with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged, not through inheritance or lineage, but through something far more lasting, love earned, trust given, and wounds healed. At breakfast, the family no longer sat in silence. Charles read aloud news from the Times, while Henry corrected the pronunciation of obscure scientific terms. Margaret described the sky in colours only she could see. Samuel leaned against Lucinda's side, his small hand finding hers without looking. Charles had changed too. He rose early to help Henry with diagrams, carried Margaret's easel to the garden without protest, and learned to braid Samuel's hair with admirable effort, if not success. He was not perfect, but he was present, and that had made all the difference. Lucinda, now Mrs. Ashford, kept her days busy with the rhythm of home. She corresponded with her father each week, oversaw the children's lessons, and had begun organizing a reading circle for local girls in the lower district. She wore simple gowns with soft embroidery, her hair pinned loosely at her nape, a gold band on her finger that seemed to glow brighter when touched by sunlight or Charles's glance. One afternoon, as April reached its middle, she received a letter sealed in familiar blue wax. "My dearest daughter," it read. "Last week at the post office, a man I've known 40 years asked if I was kin to Mrs. Ashford of Fifth Avenue, and I said yes. I said it with my chest full and my heart steady, because, my Lou, they speak your name in this city with reverence, not because of whom you married, but because of who you are." She read it twice before tucking it into a drawer beside her mother's locket. That evening, the family dined together beneath a chandelier that once glinted only on cold silver. Now it caught warmth, reflected in laughter, in the clink of dishes, in Charles's softened eyes as he watched his children adore a woman the world once said could never be one of them. After dinner, Margaret asked for more paper. Samuel insisted she sit by his bed. Henry recited a passage from Da Vinci's notebooks. And when the house was finally quiet, Lucinda found Charles in the garden. The hyacinths had bloomed again. He looked up from a bench beneath the tree she'd once brushed snow from. "You never stopped saving us," he said. "I never stopped loving you," she replied. They stood a moment longer, letting the quiet speak. Then she leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a gesture not of urgency, but of certainty, of home. Later, as she tucked in the children and dimmed the lamps, her footsteps soft on the carpeted stairs, one truth lingered around her like a prayer. She was never meant to belong. But now, no one could imagine the Ashfords without her. It was the spring of 1893, and Fifth Avenue shimmered with soft light reflected from storefront glass and carriage wheels. But the grandest change was not in the street's marble facades. It was in the home nestled behind ivy-draped gates, where laughter still lived but had grown deeper, more seasoned with time. Lucinda Ashford sat at the piano in the drawing room, her fingers idling across ivory keys, while a toddler with unruly auburn curls clung to her skirts. Little Clara, born 2 winters ago, had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn heart. Across the room, Samuel, now 9, read aloud from a book of legends, pausing every few lines to glance at the girl in his mother's arms with theatrical emphasis. Henry, 15 and solemn in appearance but secretly tender, sketched a gear design at the desk by the window, and Margaret, blooming into young womanhood, painted peonies on silk panels bound for a charity exhibition. Charles had returned early from the office, his cravat loosened and a smudge of ink on his thumb. He greeted Lucinda with a kiss to her temple and scooped Clara up into his arms with practiced ease. He was no longer a man who merely lived in his house. He belonged to it, in all the quiet ways that mattered. The city had changed, and so had its people. Eleanor had never returned from Europe. Her final attempt to control the Ashford name had cost her more than she'd anticipated. Her influence waned, and the gossip she once weaponized faded as the world moved on. Lucinda's dignity had outlasted scandal. Her reading circle had grown into a thriving school for girls in the lower district, with Margaret as a budding patron and mentor. The Ashford name was now whispered with something close to reverence, but not because of wealth or legacy, because of how it was rebuilt from within. Lucinda received letters still from her father, though age now trembled in his handwriting. In one he wrote, "I feared they'd never truly see you, Lucinda. But now I think the world sees more clearly because of you." Some evenings Charles still walked to the family crypt, not in mourning, but in remembrance. He would stand in the silence and speak softly, telling his late wife about the family that had found new joy, without erasing her memory. The love that had come after had not replaced the past, it had healed it. And Lucinda, she stood by the garden gate each dusk, often holding Clara, always watching the sky shift from gold to indigo. She no longer wondered if she belonged, because home was not built of walls or names. It was made of shared books and Sunday soup, of soot-stained fingers on a teacup, of Margaret's laughter echoing through the halls, of Charles reaching for her hand in sleep, of Samuel insisting she read just one more chapter, of Clara curling up in her arms as though the world outside could never touch them. It was made of time, yes, but also of the choice to stay. And no one, not even the world that once doubted her, could imagine the Ashfords without Lucinda. Some stories begin with a whisper and end with a home filled with laughter. Lucinda Hartwell's journey reminds us that belonging is not granted by birthright nor by the approval of society, but by the quiet, unwavering courage to stay, to love, and to heal. She didn't just teach 3 grieving children to smile again. She rebuilt a man's soul and transformed a house into a sanctuary. Perhaps you've known a Lucinda. Perhaps in your own way, you are one. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to write the word belong in the comments. It helps us know who stayed with us to the very end, and it keeps this little corner of storytelling alive. And if you feel moved to support the team that brings these love stories to life, you can send a super thanks in any amount you wish. Every bit helps us keep writing, voicing, and sharing. But if that's not possible, sharing this video with someone who loves emotional, historical romance is just as powerful. Stay with us. There are more stories waiting. Don't forget to check the cards for similar tales of forbidden love, resilience, and redemption. Thank you for being part of this one.